Hello friends, in this session I'd like to discuss about the message logging policy. Let me give you a brief recap of policy before discussing message logging policy. So it is a policy that we configure in API manager. Usually we configure policies in API manager, and those policies are enforced on your API runtime, right? So the runtime contain two layers. One is the API gateway layer and the backend API layer, implementation layer. So all our APIs are deployed in implementation layer, and the policies, whatever policies we configured for that API in API manager, they are downloaded to the orchestration layer via API runtime manager agent. This is a guy downloads the APIs, downloads the policies on the API from manager to orchestration layer. So when a request comes from the client, first this policy will encounter the request and request routed to the backend actual implementation. Right? This is a usual way. So when coming to message logging policy, what we can do is we configure some policy called message logging policy for an API running in Mule runtime. So when the client invokes that API, the message logging policy will log the message before invoking the API and after invoking the API. Means you want to log some message before executing your application and after execution application. This policy is quite useful. So let me demonstrate this policy in action. Let me show you the API I designed to demonstration. Let me go to the AnyPoint Design Center. For this, I designed a very simple API. My main motto is not about the providing design. My motto is to demonstrate the message logging policy, right? So this is very simple API with one resource and one get method and the post method. Okay, for this API, I want to configure the message logging policy. I publish this API to the exchange and I register this API in the API manager. Let me show you the API manager. In the API manager, I registered this API. So you can I got the API instance ID, auto discovery ID, right? So let me create one simple mail application. I'm opening mail application. I'm creating a very simple mail application based on the API. My application name I'm giving as student API APL based on the. So my application generated the flows scaffolding by using scaffolding from the API. So it generates two flows. One is get and post. So I want to uh, log the API before invoking the API and after invoking the API. It means I want to create some student via post method, via post flow. Right. For that, what I'm doing is I'm adding a simple transformation. Okay. So let me show you what the payload I'm planning to post to this API. So very simple payload, that is the student name and gender. Only two fields, very simple payload and post to this API. And what my requirement is, if the student is a female student, I want to get Miss as a title. And if the student is a male student, I want to get the Mr. as the title. Right? A simple transformation I designed inside the API. Okay. So the post method and posting this API, right? So in the post flow, I am configuring a simple transformation. The transformation is just adding the title to this student. Right? So just I'm configured a title function inside the variable, and I'm calling get title plus payload dot name. Right. So don't worry, it is a build issue. There's no error in the transformation, right? Now I want to add the auto discovery also. Create API auto discovery ID. Let me copy the API auto discovery ID from here. It links your API manager and the policy, right? Okay, right. So I configure the auto discovery so that the link get established between your API manager and the instance running your runtime. Okay, now I want to configure this thing. I want to configure a policy inside my manager. So I want to configure message logging policy. Go to API manager and click on the instance. Go to the policy section. This is important concept in this demo, right? I'm adding a policy, add policy, and what policy I'm adding? I'm adding message logging policy. Select the message logging policy. Next. And if you observe the message logging policy, there are two sections instance, two before calling API and after calling API. Okay. So this configuration I want to configure for before calling API, and I will configure one more section for after calling API. Okay. This message indicates before calling API what message you want to print to the log, right? So we can give the data view expression over here. I'm giving a simple data view expression before calling API. I want to print the payload the before calling API. Very simple. Before calling API, one string I want to print. After that, whatever payload is sending from the client application, that payload I want to print over here. So this is the body of my data view expression. And the condition means what condition you want to log this message to the your log file. If you don't give any condition, it will log every message irrespective of because there is no condition, it will log every message. But if you have some condition, there is some requirement say that if this condition matches, then only you want to log the message. In that case, you need to configure a condition. To demonstration purpose, I'm configuring very simple condition over here for before logging. So thing like I'm passing from query parameter. If city is in Hyderabad, then only I want to log. If city is not within Hyderabad, I don't want to log the before calling message. Right. So I want to add one more configuration for after calling. So for that add, and this thing I'm giving is after calling after get students, and some configuration name, and the message. What message you want to print after calling the API? So after calling also I want to print the same payload that I'm this after calling students API. This payload not get is not okay. Okay. Then in the after calling, I don't want to configure any condition because demonstration purpose. Okay, for before I already configure, but after calling I don't configuring any condition. And this one I'm checking as after calling, right? So now I'm applying the policy. There is some error over here. I think there is some space in the starting and apply the policy. The policy get applied. Now I want to deploy this application, right? So for demonstration purpose, I want to deploy this application in my Mule embedded server. Uh, you guys can deploy to the cloud hub and test one. Okay. Let me deploy this application to the embedded server. Until then, I will pause a video for a few seconds. So application got deployed, and you can see one statement in the console. The statement is applied policy message logging. right? This policy also got applied on my API. Now I'm trying to hit the API. So I got some response. Let me see. See, before calling the API, this is the payload, and after calling API, I concatenated both Swapna and as a female. This is the Miss Swapna. Let me quickly call some male name as Venkat. Send it. So this is before calling, and Mr. Venkat is after calling, right? Okay. So this policy is quite useful when you want to configure your application a log message before invoking your API and after invoking in API also. And you configure some conditions on what conditions you want to log the messages, all the stuff, right? So thank you so much and happy learning.